Good morning, good day, and good afternoon, depending on where you live. Uh, I we have received news that Artyomovsk, or Bakhmut, as the Ukrainians call it, um, is pretty much surrounded. Not completely, but according to Prigozhin, it is. Or it's gonna be surrounded. I never really understood it, but in a RT article here, he claims it is. In another interview, he said it's going to be surrounded in about 2 days. Regardless of that, the situation for the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut is extremely bad. Um, Madyar, I think, he's a war reporter from the Ukrainian side. He also admitted that the situation is extremely bad. He requested that him and his unit was going to be uh, pulled out from Bakhmut, and they have been pulled out. There are reports of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing the battlefield in an unorganized way. Uh, there's also other reports that Zelensky is ordering more troops to be, sent into Bakhmut. So the reports are kind of skewed in many ways. The unorganized retreat is definitely true. There's been many telegraph videos about this. Um, it is said that the average lifespan in the battlefield of Bakhmut is 4 hours for Ukrainian soldiers. So it's definitely hell on earth. But I thought we can go through the Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, what he is saying basically. So Yevgeny Prigozhin has called on Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky to allow Kiev's forces to retreat from Artyomovsk. The Wagner private military company has de facto completely surrounded the key city of Artyomovsk, referred to as Bakhmut in Ukraine, the group's leader Yevgeny Prigozhin announced on Friday. In a video apparently shot on the outskirts of the city, the Wagner chief personally addressed Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, or Volodymyr Zelensky, telling him that the Donbass city has been encircled and that there is now only one road left out of the city. Just out of, curiosity or research purposes, I actually read The Art of War, right? And it is speculated that one of the reasons why the Russians have left one road open, or not just in the case of Bakhmut, but in other cities and places, is because when you allow the enemy's troops to surrender or to sort of flee, the fighting will be less intense or something like that, because when you cut off the route of retreat, your soldiers will fight like hell, basically. But whatever. The Russians are going to create something called a cauldron, right? This is a standard tactic that they use. They cut off the escape routes and basically surround the whole military brigades and units, and just, if they don't want to give up, they pound the shit out of them with artillery. And one thing that the Russians have in store is basically artillery. I mean, that one advice that the Western backers of Ukraine has given to Ukrainian government is to stop trying to outmatch the Russians with artillery, because there's an 1 to 10 or 1 to 8 ratio when it comes to artillery pieces, right? The Russians have like 10 times more artillery devices, it's called, yeah, and they have a shit ton of more ammunition. The Russian war machine or economy has basically adapted to a wartime economy. Now, the NATO stand countries are waking up and say we must do the same, but I don't think they can do it, because their weapons industries are for the most part privatized. They're centered around profit, not for need. And in the Russian military complex is different. It's centered around need, basically. And Russian military factories are just spinning out T-90s, T-72s, and other types of military equipment and ammunition. So yeah, but we can go on. The pincers are closing shut, announced Prigozhin. He added that previously the Wagner Group had been fighting a professional Ukrainian army, but is now instead coming across more and more old men and children. They are fighting, but life in Bakhmut is short. A day or two, Prigozhin said. The Wagner chief urged the Ukrainian president to allow them to leave the city as the camera pans to what appear to be captured Ukrainian soldiers. Among them is a man with a long gray beard and two very young-looking men. They also issued a plea to Zelensky asking him to let them return home to their families and loved ones and not to ignore their requests. I think I've seen that video. The city of Artyomovsk, which has seen some of the heaviest fighting amid Russia's ongoing military campaign as part of a 70-kilometer Ukrainian defense line created since Kiev initiated the fighting in Donbass in 2014. In a month-long campaign, Russian forces, primarily Wagner members, have systematically captured settlements around the city and have been surrounding Artyomovsk from the north, south, and east. Zelensky had long insisted that the strategically vital city would not be surrounded under any circumstances, but he has also recently changed his position. After Kiev's forces suffered heavy losses in the city's defense, Zelensky recently stated that Artyomovsk would be held only as long as it remains reasonable to do so. Kiev's Western backers have encouraged the Ukrainian leader to cut his losses and withdraw from the city. Yeah, we've gone through articles where they have encouraged him to do that. And yeah, I find it funny that the NATO bloc countries are still trolling that Russia is still losing the war. And I've spoken to a few, well, I haven't spoken, they pretty much talk freely. I live in Sweden. It's a very anti-Russian, Russophobic country. And especially among middle-aged white Swedish men who have served in the military, they have a very skewed 1980s Cold War view of Russia. They often say that Russians are incompetent, their soldiers are trash, they are this and that. And, you know, I find that funny because most Swedish men who have served in the army have not been in a real battlefield. Those few that have gone to war have been in Mali, maybe Kosovo, maybe Afghanistan, but recently it's been Mali and Afghanistan, basically. These guys have met non-conventional armies for the most part, and if they have met conventional armies in the past, it's been pretty weak ones, right? The Taliban is not a conventional army. They have no air support, they have no artillery support, and they still manage to kick your ass. Not specifically necessarily Sweden per se, but I'm talking about the whole NATO bloc, ISAF forces. You all ran like rats from a sinking ship when the Taliban took power. And every military intervention that Western countries have done has ended up in failure. So for these guys to sit here and toot their own horn like this, it's kind of laughable, really. I mean, when it comes to military operations, Sweden has always been this kid that's, with the exception of maybe Afghanistan and Mali, but when it comes to, for example, Libya, Sweden really didn't participate with soldiers. It didn't even bomb targets, allegedly. What they did was they sent out planes for reconnaissance, and they told the Americans and the French and the others and where to bomb in Libya so you could destroy Muammar Gaddafi's military, right? That's what they did, which was serious as well. I'm not trying to minimize the role of the Swedish imperialist involvement here, but what I'm trying to say is you haven't, or Sweden hasn't been hasn't really met a serious foe with artillery support, conventional airplane support, and all this stuff. And do I think that the Russian army is invincible? Absolutely not. The Russian army makes mistakes. We saw that in the beginning of the special military operation in Ukraine. They sent in the amount of troops they sent in were not enough. Their defense lines were stretched out, and that's what led to Ukraine retaking Izium, which is part of the Kharkiv Oblast. And well, you know, and then they're going to talk about Kherson. Kherson was a planned retreat. That's the thing. Ukraine had sent brigades upon brigades trying to recapture Kherson, and they lost almost 10,000 men doing so. And the Russian losses were minuscule in that war, or in that battle, so to speak. That was a planned retreat where the Russians purposely retreated their forces, so because they said they had received intelligence that the Ukrainians were about to blast the some dam in the Dnieper River, which would have pretty much flooded the city, isolated the troops, the Russian troops, and the casualties would have been very high. So Russia rather gives up territory to save its soldiers, because territory can be recaptured anyway, right? And the arrogance from the people here, where I live, is astounding. It's almost scary to watch that people here lack critical thinking skills. They are not in any way, shape, or form willing to listen to the other side of the argument. If you even as much as say something that could incriminate the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian war machine and politicians, well, you're going to be considered a pro-Russian stooge, a agent, and so forth and so forth. And you can be, socially frozen out from your job. You can get bad references. Hey, perhaps you can even get fired. So, yeah, there can be some consequences if you openly dare to speak out against the mafia regime that is currently residing in Kiev, right? Or the fascist junta, so to speak. And we're going to speak more, speaking of fascism, we're going to speak about the Russian, so-called Russian neo-Nazi that attacked a Russian border town. Yeah. So that's the story from Artyomovsk, and that's the situation in Sweden. I try to keep my mouth shut at work when I hear my colleagues talk about Russia and the war in Ukraine. They have this naive picture of the Ukrainian military as being these benevolent fighters, and they don't commit any human rights abuses at all. Despite that, there has been many video footages of Ukrainian soldiers and brigadesmen and battalions and so forth. So when they have captured Russian soldiers, they have done horrific things to them, castrating them, stabbing them, shooting them in their knee, urinating on them, calling their girlfriends and wives, and just doing all types of horrific shit. On the other side, I have seen Russian soldiers actually taking care of Ukrainian prisoners, prisoners of war. There has been, prison swaps from both sides. So I would rather say that the Russians are far more benevolent when it comes to their when it comes to the prisoners of war. I'm not saying they haven't done anything wrong. There definitely has been human rights abuses. Unfortunately, war brings out the most savage side of man, you know, the bloodthirst, right? That's why war is hell, and we want to avoid it at all costs. But I understand from the Russian side that this is considered a existential threat, and yeah, that's why the Russian Federation eventually intervened. Anyway, the next article is also on RT, and it's about a man named, let's see, what's his name? Denis Nikitin. Yes. This guy is a very strange individual. I mean, I kind of find it funny that the writer of the article didn't really go deeper into his alleged Jewish ancestry. I don't know if he lied about being Jewish so he can immigrate to Germany back in the day, because Germany had this law about Jewish people being allowed to immigrate to their country or something like that. But we're going to go through that in the article. I thought that was kind of weird. So yeah, and also I have to stress again, well, I have to make a point here. I find it really funny that a Slavic person is a neo-Nazi. I've never really been able to grasp that mind, like that. Like, how do you justify this? Like, because I'm actually currently reading Mein Kampf, and yeah, Hitler explicitly shows anti-Slavic sentiment. He doesn't like Slavic people. Okay, he talks about how the Habsburg monarchy in Austria is allegedly trying to minimize and destroy the German language and culture. They are Slavifying the country. The king of this Habsburg monarchy intermarries with a Czech woman. And yeah, he doesn't like that. And so for me, when I hear a Russian or a Polish person, or I don't know, Serbian, or perhaps Ukrainian and Croatian, I can understand a little bit more, because they weren't necessarily subjected to extermination and slavery by the Third Reich, because Hitler made some tactical alliances with some Slavic people, Bosniaks, some Ukrainians, that is to say mainly Western Ukrainians. And he even created a Russian Free Army brigade by this Russian general, who I forgot the name of, during World War II, who surrendered to the Germans, and then went over to fight on their side. And he created this army corps of Russians who were fighting for the German Wehrmacht, so to speak. It wasn't just ethnic Russians in there. There were many other Soviet citizens that fought in that voluntary group. With that being said, the absolute majority of Soviet citizens opposed Nazi Germany. But it is estimated that 1 million Soviet citizens cooperated with the Wehrmacht in one way or another. Despite that, the Nazis viewed many of these citizens, especially of Slavic descent, as subhumans, right? And the whole goal of Hitler for taking over Soviet Union and do these extermination raids of the Eastern Slavic people was to give a Lebensraum to Germanic people. So, yeah. But anyway, these guys have a very skewed worldview and ideology. So, one of Europe's top right-wing extremists, who is the neo-Nazi behind this week's Ukrainian attack? Who is the neo-Nazi behind this week's Ukrainian attack in Russia's Bryansk region? This piece of POS, I'm not going to curse here, actually killed 2 civilians. One of them was a 10-year-old girl. So, yeah, not only is he a traitor to his country, he is a piece of shit. Well, there, I said it. I couldn't hold it. The organizer of the terrorist incident near the 2 states' shared border moved to Kiev in The organizer of the terrorist incident near the 2 states' shared border moved to Kiev in 2017 and has a long association with far-right violence. Denis was his name, right? Denis, yes. Denis is not the only Russian that has defected to the Ukrainian side. You see, in the early 2000s, there was a rise of racially motivated murders, hundreds of racially motivated murders in Russia, right? For quite some time, the Russian authorities turned a blind eye on it. However, eventually, the Russian government, which was a pretty slick move, and this is for the people who claim that I don't criticize Russia, by the way, I do. They decided to create the counter-extremism law, which would eventually round up these guys, put them in prison, a lot of them. Some of them were killed in prison, and many of them fled Russia. Ukraine was one of those places where they fled. And these Russians were later on, they would join the Azov Brigade, or Azov Battalion. Sorry, battalion, yes. And I think up to 200 Russian white supremacists joined the Azov Battalion. And they joined the Azov Battalion because they had a hostility to the Putin government. Putin is a nationalist, however, he's not an ethno-nationalist. He is a civic nationalist, right? These guys are ethno-nationalists. In fact, Denis, if I understood it correctly from the article, he wants Russia to give up the Asian part of Russia and just keep like Moscow and the European parts of Russia. Pretty fucking stupid if you ask me, because why would you... anyway, there's a lot of natural resources in those areas and stuff like that, so why would you do that? But, you know, ethno-nationalists tend not to be very bright people. Yeah, that's the philosophy. And one thing, if I understood the whole dynamics of Russian politics correctly, is that the Russian government has tolerated some fascist movements in their country because they don't carry out any major operations or threats anymore inside of Russia. So, for example, the Russian Imperial Movement, the RIM, they have a brigade that's fighting in the Donbass right now. It's called Rusich, right? And these guys, they're Nazis, a lot of them, right? And there's Nazis in the Wagner group. Majority of the people in Wagner are not Nazis. I totally disagree with that description. But there are some people in there that are Nazis, definitely. And Prigozhin was asked this question, by the way, by a Russian war reporter called War Gonzo. He asked him, why what do you have to say about some of your men that sport Third Reich symbolism? He said, okay, well, there are people here that, you know, support the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, and we don't really care about ideological leaning. We care about if you got balls, you know, to fight. And extremists, regardless of ideological spectra, a lot of times, with the exception of maybe, lame liberals, they tend to be the best fighting force. So, yeah, I can understand why they put them on the front line. And I guess it's kind of a cheap way to get rid of, certain political opponents if they get killed in the battlefield. You can speculate left and right, because the far right have been a opponent to the Putin government, and they can be seen as a dangerous force because of their past violent activities back in the day. So yes, now you would say, okay, isn't it hypocritical of Russia to talk about denazification and stuff like this? Well, Putin actually talked about that, and he said, yeah, in Russia we have some idiots that walk around with swastikas and tiki torches and stuff like that, but they're not in any major political positions. They're not incorporated in the Russian army. They're not incorporated in the Russian government. They're not in the Russian security services, which is the difference between Russia and Ukraine. In Ukraine, they have integrated them into the military, such as the Aidar battalion, the Azov battalion, the Svoboda unit. These are all ideological, units and brigades that are openly neo-Nazi. They have received a lot of political power. They are in the SBU. You have the Kraken unit, right? They crack down on, these guys are fascists. They crack down on political opponents. Russia doesn't have that in that sense. So yeah, but the Wagner Group is a organization that's open to all political affiliations, left-leaning or right-wing leaning, as long as you have, the stomach, the minerals, the balls, whatever you want to call it, to go out and do a lot of close combat fighting, which they're known for, because the Wagner Group is trained to do a lot of close quarter combat, and that's a very difficult form of combat. So, nonetheless, let's move on. And may I also stress that the majority of the people that have been fighting in the Donbass for the last 8 years up until now have been neo-Bolshevik or civic nationalists. So the far right elements in among these forces are definitely, you can't even compare that to Ukraine. Yes. On Thursday morning, a group of armed operatives, let's see where we're at. A group of armed operatives crossed the border from Ukraine into Russia's Bryansk region. The so-called Russian Volunteer Corps, RDK, or Ruski Dobrovolchesky Korpus, consisting of Russians fighting for the Ukrainian armed forces, claimed responsibility for the incursion. President Vladimir Putin branded the incident yet another terrorist attack, another crime. They entered the border territory and opened fire at civilians. A video has been released by the RDK claiming responsibility for the crime, featuring Denis Nikitin, a neo-Nazi with wide international connections known as White Rex in far-right circles. He called on Russian citizens to switch sides and join the Ukrainian army. Nikitin claimed his group only targets Russian soldiers and never attacks civilians. Who is this man? What is his connection to Ukraine and its armed forces? And how did a football hooligan become a prominent figure in the European and American neo-Nazi underworld? Now that is a good question. Football hooligans historically have been a potent recruitment center for a lot of fascists and neo-Nazi groups because of their capability of using violence, right? In fact, the founders of the Azov battalion started out as football hooligans. Now, there are many reasons to why football hooligans are attractive recruiters or soldiers for the cause, so to speak. Besides the whole love for violence and bloodshed, they also are willing to fight for something that's greater than themselves. To be honest with you, I don't even think a lot of football hooligans give a shit about football per se. In fact, Nikitin will explicitly talk about this in this article. It says here, I don't love football, I love ass kicking. Yeah. But anyway, football hooligan. Denis Nikitin's real name is Kapustin. He is about 39 years old and was born in Russia. In 2001, his family moved to Cologne, Germany, taking advantage of rules on Jewish relocation, where Nikitin became interested in martial arts. When he was 22, he got involved with local football ultras, became a skinhead, and took part in regular street violence and brawls, according to his own account. He later moved back to Russia, leaving his family behind without explaining why. Upon his return to Russia, he joined the ultras who support the CSKA Moscow soccer team. And this is the part I didn't really understand. Why hasn't the journalist that wrote this article not talked about where he says here, taking advantage of rules on Jewish relocation? Is he actually Jewish? Or did he pretend to be Jewish so he can, get relocation to Germany? Because in 2001, in the early 2000s, as we've spoken before, Russia's economy was not that good. This was not too long ago from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Things were slowly stabilizing, but there were still problems with unemployment, low birth rates. And one of the reasons why a lot of young Russians back in the day were joining far-right groups, I think is because of the disappointment of how the communists sort of got corrupted and, allowed the Soviet Union to be pretty much chopped up and split up. You're trying to find a new identity in this turbulent time. The economic situation was bad, and a lot of economic immigrants from Central Asia, from the Caucasus, were coming to Russia to find jobs that, according to many Russians, were taken by them, and they didn't like that. So these skinhead gangs would roam around in Moscow and St. Petersburg and just violently attack foreign students, like I said, Central Asian and Caucasian immigrants, and they would film these acts and put them up on the internet. And they were pretty brutal attacks, to be honest with you. Now, a lot of these guys, as I said before, were arrested. They were put in prison. Some of them were killed in prison. So a lot of those skinhead gangs in Russia were kind of, cleaned up, basically. One effective thing that Putin did was to sort of play out different radical right-wing groups against each other, I guess. And that's why many Russian white supremacists fled after the counter-extremism laws were introduced. They fled to Ukraine, where they were, fighting on the Ukrainian side against the Russian Federation. But anyway, when he was 22, he got involved with local football ultras and became a skinhead and took part in regular street violence and brawls, according to... No, actually, I read that already. Sorry. And here we talk about his so-called passion for football, right? So, I don't know any of the players' names. I don't know the club's history. I had a hard time finding the arena. I like the adrenaline rush. I like running around the city. He outlined in an interview with Ukraine's Zaborona, where he described his views as white supremacy over all kinds of monkeys. What a guy. I mean, if this guy is actually Jewish, and he's got to be the biggest troll of the century, man. This is like Laura Southern, man. Laura Southern did all, she worked for the whole alt-right movement and stuff like that. Turns out she was Jewish, but she dated like black guys and Middle Eastern guys and stuff like that. It was all exposed, and she just got the fuck out of Dodge. She she received a lot of money from a bunch of, alt-right cucks, basically. But nonetheless, alt-right simps, sorry, not cucks. Dennis maintained his connections with German fans after moving to Russia. He participated in their brawls when he visited Germany, joining the Köln Ultras. The police filed criminal charges against him after an attack on Schalke supporters in 2014. His case was before the court for 3 years, but the final ruling is unknown. Sports empire. Nikitin started his own clothing brand, White Rex, in 2008. The product made use of Nazi symbols, and its target audience was football fans. The central element of the logo was the black sun, a symbol originating in Nazi Germany and later employed by neo-Nazis. In his book, Hooligans, A World Between Football, Violence and Politics, Robert Klaus, an author and expert on far-right movements, called Denis Nikitin a Nazi businessman. Nikitin wants to be a kind of priorities supplier to the Nazis, he wrote, quoting Nikitin, who once said that the philosophy of his White Rex brand was a cater to all the needs of a modern man. Nikitin went on to expand his business activities. In 2011, he began organizing MMA tournaments in Russia. The first was held in Voronezh under the slogan Warrior Spirit, and followed by others all over the country, garnering him high status among local far-right groups. His MMA events required candidates to be strictly of white race and focused on amateurs rather than professionals. In 2013, Russian TV channel Boyets, meaning fighter, named White Rex as the promotion campaign of the year. Nikitin's 2013 Rising Nation MMA tournament was named the best in the country. I wanted to recruit new athletes and launch them into our ideological orbit, Nikitin said. When asked his motivation was for organizing the tournaments. So I thought about something here. Yes, actually, we're going to get into that. Sorry, I haven't reached that point yet, but I'm going to make a statement, so to speak. Before long, he decided to expand his reach further and began launching tournaments in post-Soviet republics. While Ukraine welcomed his initiative, it was banned in Belarus, and Nikitin was nearly arrested there. However, he continued to promote his sports empire in the West. Nikitin developed connections in many European countries. He befriended members of Casa Pound Italy, an Italian neo-fascist movement that praises Benito Mussolini as its ideological leader. With its support, Nikitin held a number of MMA tournaments in Rome. In Germany, Nikitin organized a large-scale tournament dubbed Kampf der Nibelungen, meaning the struggle of the Nibelungs, with the support of National Democratic Party of Germany and its youth wing Jugendnationalisten, Young Nationalists. White Rex also ran MMA tournaments in Finland, France, Czech Republic, Romania, and other countries. Additionally, Nikitin held a series of MMA fighting master classes for nationalist groups in the UK and Switzerland. And here we go. Monitored by special services. In this way, Nikitin had become a key figure among far-right extremists in Europe, noted Robert Klaus. According to some anti-Nazi reports, in addition to organizing sports tournaments with heavy far-right slant, Nikitin financially sponsored neo-Nazis and bankrolled their music festivals. Nikitin's rising popularity among far-right groups didn't go unnoticed by the authorities. All of his MMA tournaments in Russia were watched closely by the police. Nikitin himself admitted that every one of them was monitored by the Russian Department for Countering Extremism. In some cities, they demanded the list of all participants. In others, they recorded everything on camera, openly or covertly. We didn't break any laws. I don't put up any flags with swastikas. I didn't give people any access, encouraging them to go somewhere and smash whatever's in their way. Now, notice what he said about the swastikas. In Russia, it's actually officially outlawed to be a neo-Nazi. The Mein Kampf movement, Mein Kampf book is outlawed because of its anti-Slavic sentiment, and many famous National Socialist or Nazi movements have been banned in Russia, such as the National Socialist Union, as well as Blood and Honor, right? The two of the most famous ones. And that's probably also a big difference between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine doesn't have a ban on these parties. In fact, they incorporated them in government positions and police and military positions. So, yeah. Nikitin dismissed any allegations of extremism as opinions of some far-left dumb fucks, as he said, right? Quoted. In 2016, Nikitin brought 100 Russian hooligans to the UEFA European Football Championship games in Marseille, France. There, the Russian ultras brutally fought with English fans, beating them so hard that 2 Englishmen ended up hospitalized in a coma and 1 remained partially paralyzed for life. A year later, British state media found and spoke to the organizer of that group of Russian football hooligans. The man interviewed wore a ski mask and a white Rex t-shirt, introducing himself as Dennis. He looked and sounded a lot like Nikitin. In 2018, as Russia was preparing to host the FIFA World Cup, it saw the need to rein in the ultras. Following the incident in Marseille, tensions between football fans and the Russian government had mounted as the latter feared the reputational damage to the World Cup host nation. The brawl in Marseille had made Nikitin persona non grata, both in Russia and much of Europe, so he moved to Ukraine in 2017. Yeah, man, this is, there's still a little bit left of the article. So here they talk about his time in exile. So in October 2017, the Reconquista Club opened in Kiev. Its name is dedicated to so-called Ukrainian Reconquista, a movement to promote Ukrainian influence in Europe. On Fridays, fist fights and other types of hand-to-hand combat, my apologies, were organized at the club. All in all, it hosted 40 MMA tournaments. In May of 2018, Robert Rundo, the founder of the California-based far-right Rise Above movement, RAM, fought at the Reconquista. A few months later, Rundo and the 3 other RAM members were arrested in the US for participating in the white supremacist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that had taken place in August of 2017. The FBI called RAM an extremist group of white supremacy and revealed that Rundo was acquainted with members of the Azov paramilitary and neo-Nazi group. Rundo did meet in Kiev with its representatives, most notably with Elena Semeniaka, the international secretary of the National Corps, a political party that emerged from Azov battalion. Semeniaka confirmed that Americans had come to sports competitions and were interested in Azov experiences in organizing youth movements. Speaking of Azov battalion, Uh, in fact, the financier of the Azov battalion was a Greek, Cypriot, Jewish, Ukrainian man named Ihor Kolomoisky. And recently, some of his properties have been seized by the Ukrainian government, allegedly, right? Uh, this guy organized and armed, he pumped it in with a bunch of money and stuff. But some would argue, why would a Jewish man fund this movement, right? Well, he really doesn't give a shit if they are neo-Nazis. He cares about the muscle. These guys are violent, they are ruthless, and basically they're ready to do the dirty work. So yeah, that's the reason. But anyway, most of all, Runda was inspired by Denis Nikitin, the organizer of the MMA fights at the Reconquista. Runda was so fascinated by Nikitin that even he got a tattoo with his brand's logo. However, very little is known about Nikitin's life in Ukraine. It's as if a line splits the man's biography into before and after he left Russia. In 2019, he stopped organizing large sporting events and dropped completely off the radar. Reports of his arrest by security services would circulate now and again, but were never confirmed. In 2022, after the military operation in Ukraine began, Nikitin suddenly resurfaced in the ranks of the RDK, a unit within Ukraine's armed forces. He spoke in an interview about his motivation. If Russia for Russians is reduced to the size of Moscow or the Moscow region or the European part of Russia, I'm okay with that as a nationalist. This is where I see eye to eye with Ukrainian nationalists. Well, Ukrainian nationalists view you as subhuman. Yeah, let's keep it 1,000. The ideology of white supremacy in Ukraine views Russians as the descendants or like a mongrel race of Slavic and Mongolian and Tatar people. So they're like a mix of basically these Asiatic hordes and these white Slavic people as they see it, right? And that's why they view them as racially inferior or something. It's kind of ridiculous, really, but yeah, whatever. It's anti-Russian sentiment like this is nothing new. But anyway, let's see here. The Nazi diaspora. This is an interesting one. So, by the time Nikitin moved to Ukraine, there was already a large diaspora of far-right Russians in place. Among them was Alexei Livkin, founder of the neo-Nazi organization Wutan Jugend, who had fought in Donbass as part of the Azov battalion. Another Russian citizen, Sergei Korotkych, nicknamed Botsman, had also joined the unit. He too had fought for Ukraine in Donbass and personally received his Ukrainian passport from Pyotr Poroshenko, Ukraine's fifth president. Some investigative journalists also believe Korotkych may have been involved in the 2016 murder of journalist Pavel Sheremet in Kiev. So let's see here. Among Nikitin's contacts in Kiev was Kirill Kanakhin, aka Radonsky. In 2018, he moved to Ukraine after charges were pressed against him in Russia. He served in the Azov battalion for a while before becoming a yoga instructor. While his CV says he charges around $1,000 per class, that's a lot of money. He also posts photos on social media containing weapons and swastikas styled after Hindu ornaments. Additionally, he appeared in photos and videos with Nikitin that were shot by the RDK in the Bryansk region. Nikitin had good relations with many high-profile ultra-right-wingers in Ukraine, including Semenyanka. He facilitated her ties with Italian and German neo-Nazis. She never tried to hide Nikitin's involvement. In 2017, they visited a conference in Warsaw, organized by Polish white supremacy organization Sezturmovski. Sorry if I butchered that together, right? At the conference, Nikitin portrayed Azov as Europe's only legal far-right paramilitary organization. Russian bloggers took an interest in him as well. In an interview with libertarian Mikhail Svetov in January 2023, Nikitin discussed sabotage on Russian territory. He said the Ukrainian military leadership didn't resort to sabotage because it had a sense of honor and sought to defeat the enemy on the battlefield as gentlemen do. He argued that there was no need for incursions. He also declared he had political ambitions in post-war Russia. In an interview with Russian journalist Oleg Kashin last November, Nikitin said he may have felt sympathy for civilians in Russia, but most of them considered him a Nazi. Well, what the hell does he expect, right? I became an enemy as soon as the newspapers and the TV said so, he noted. He also stressed that he didn't shoot civilians. At the same time, he considered everybody expressing verbal support for the Russian army or who had even paid taxes as combatants. Well, then that's going to be a whole lot of people that you're going to kill, your own countrymen, right? Kiev has denied its involvement in the RDK. We're going to go through that in the next article, which is an Azerbaijani news outlet. But it's from the Financial Times originally. But anyway, Kiev has denied its involvement in the RDK raid in Bryansk region. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhail Podolyak called the event a classic provocation. Russia wants to scare its own people to give at least some justification to its aggression and growing poverty after a year of fighting, he said. Well, that's a freaking lie, because even the IMF has admitted that the Russian economy has only taken a slight dent of minus 2% in growth, and it's going to actually grow with 0.3%. Because Russia had prepared itself for 8 years against these sanctions. We spoke about that in a previous video. Meanwhile, Nikitin is apparently safe and sound back in Ukraine, which suggests he at least had the tacit approval of powerful people in the country. Nevertheless, he is unlikely to succeed in splitting Russian society, whether it be alone or in coordination with Ukraine's military leadership. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is Denis Nikitin, right? Very odd fellow, I must say. But anyway, here we have an article by Azerbaijan 24. Kiev approved deadly raid into Russia. Neo-Nazi behind attack, tells Financial Times. The cross-border incursion earlier this week left 2 civilians dead and a young boy wounded, the Russian Federal Security Service. The recent cross-border raid on several Russian villages, which left 2 civilians dead and a young boy injured, was approved in advance by Kiev. A neo-Nazi fighter involved in the attack has told the Financial Times. The Ukrainian authorities previously tried to distance themselves from the incursion. Fighters from the Ukraine-based Russian Volunteer Corps RDK overran villages across the border in Russia's Bryansk region on Thursday, opening fire on civilian vehicles and leaving landmines and booby traps. In social media video, the Kiev-aligned group officially claimed responsibility for the attack. The Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, said they were forced back to Ukrainian territory and hit with a massive artillery strike. Speaking to Financial Times in a report published on Friday, Denis Nikitin, who appeared in the RDK video, said the Ukrainian authorities had signed off on the raid. Yes, of course, this action was agreed. Otherwise, it couldn't have happened, he claimed. How do you imagine that I passed through the dark of the night there? One of Europe's top right... No, sorry about that. Anyway, Nikitin explained that it would have been impossible for this group to slip through Ukrainian defenses and cross into Russia without some sort of green light from Kiev. There are mined bridges, there are cameras, heat-seeking drones, there are hidden open observation points, he stated. If I did not coordinate with anyone in Ukraine's military, I think we would simply be destroyed. Nikitin's comments contradicts claims by Mikhail Podolyak, a senior advisor to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who dismissed the raid as a classic deliberate provocation. Podolyak denied that Kiev was involved in what he describes as Russia's internal conflicts. Nikitin, whose real name is Denis Kapustin, has been linked to several far-right hooligan groups. The Financial Times described him as a notorious extremist with ties to neo-Nazis and white nationalists across the Western world. Nikitin has previously denied allegations of extremism, and told the Financial Times that he was unaware of any civilian casualties from the RDK's actions. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the raid as a terrorist act that purposely targeted civilians. Well, there you go. It seems like the attack was sanctioned by the Kiev regime. That's pretty much all I wanted to tell you guys from that article. But I appreciate you guys for listening, and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on any more videos. Thank you very much.